Sexual behavior differences. Umpteen surveys have been carried out in the United States and around the world, especially by the World Health Organization. These particular measures here are age of first intercourse, percentage of virgins in the sample, and number of sexual partners reported in the previous 3 months. And what you find is that Asians basically are the most sexually restrained in these surveys, whites are intermediate, and blacks are the least sexually restrained. They have an earlier onset of sexual activity, they have more sexual partners, and there are fewer percentage of virgins in any particular population. The World Health Organization have been carrying out these surveys around the world, especially in the wake of the AIDS crisis. So surveys are being done in high schools all across Black Africa, all across Europe, and throughout Japan and Asia. The pattern that you find in the United States is similarly to be found around the world. So in sexual behavior, you find exactly the same pattern of whites consistently being intermediate to blacks and Asians in sexual behavior. And this is very interesting, because what it implies is that there may be a sex hormone, some kind of neurohormonal transmitter, which is mediating sexual behavior and acts of violence simultaneously. And testosterone is a very well-known sex hormone which differentiates mostly men from women. But we now know that Asians have less testosterone than whites, and whites have less testosterone than Africans. And this explains a variety of phenomena, not just sexual behavior, not just crime and violence, but all kinds of things like voice. Africans have a deeper voice than do whites. Whites have a deeper voice than do Asians. The depth of voice is caused by the amount of testosterone circulating in the body. Muscular definition. Blacks get more muscle definition if they press weights and so on than do whites. It's very difficult for Asians to get much definition in the muscles as a result of weightlifting. And definition in muscles is due to testosterone. So this looks like a very real mediator of a lot of the social behavior variables, and it would explain a number of phenomena. If we can go to the next slide. Well, actually, let me jump from that to the most recent figures, which I haven't even made a slide of. They're so recent. The World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, every 6 months, or in the United States every 3 months, publish the latest data on AIDS. And now, today, they're publishing them on HIV rates. Here's the bottom line. 2% of black Americans today, 2 out of every 100 black people, are living with HIV in the United States. In the Caribbean, there are 7 countries that now have 2% of their population living with HIV. In black Africa, there are 37 countries whose population has 2% or more living with HIV. 5 of those countries have a 20% of their population, sexually active population, are living with HIV and will go on to get full-blown AIDS very soon. That's Uganda, Botswana, Zaire, Zimbabwe, I forget the fifth. It could be a number of them. The Republic of South Africa, those 5 countries have more than 20% of their population HIV positive. The Republic of South Africa has 3% of its black population infected with the HIV virus. Among whites in the United States or Europe, it's about 1 out of every 1,000, and among Asians in the United States, it virtually does not exist. So the sexual behavior differences that we saw translate into very real consequences. AIDS is mainly a sexually transmitted disease. And the racial differences are not just there in total amount, they're there in the pattern of AIDS. For example, among whites, it is almost entirely a homosexual problem. 95% of white people with AIDS are homosexuals. Among blacks, the sex ratio is about 60% male, about 40% female. And outside of the United States, in the Caribbean and Africa, it's a 50% male, 50% female situation, clearly showing that it's heterosexually transmitted. Now, consequences of this, and this, by the way, came out in the very end of January from the World Health Organization, maybe last November from the Centers for Disease Control. These figures are absolutely stunning. I've been following the AIDS figures for the last 10 years, and every now and again we'll collate them and publish them in some form. This was the last collation I did about a year and a half ago. I was stunned when I saw the HIV figures. This is a quantum leap in what anybody expected to be the case, and there's been almost nothing in the newspapers. The New York Times ran a big story where they focused in on Uganda, as though the 20% figure was unique to Uganda, omitting entirely the fact that all black African countries have very, very high rates, and this is impossible to check. There's not going to be any cure for AIDS in the next 4 or 5 years. If it's 2% of the population today, it'll be 3%. This is going to compound monthly. This is increasing exponentially. My prediction will be, and of course I could be wrong, is that if any one topic, and I've been debating this for the last 10 years, what will be the topic that breaks the race issue out into public awareness? Will it be crime? Will it be welfare reform? When the bell curve came out, I thought, well, it's going to be intelligence after all, because that's what we know most about. Now I'm leaning very, very strongly to make a strong prediction that it will be AIDS. In 4 or 5 years, there are going to be literally hundreds of thousands of people, mostly black people, lying in the streets of Chicago and New York City and Detroit and Miami with nowhere to go. They will be indigent. It is extremely expensive disease. At the moment, the lowest estimates are about $100,000 a year to look after somebody with full-blown AIDS. As these indigent blacks move from having HIV positive to full-blown AIDS, which can take 4 or 5 years, but we'll start doing that much earlier, there will be nowhere to put them. If you take all the hospital beds in all the jails and all the hospitals, there is no place to put the number of AIDS patients. So my guess is that it will be AIDS that breaks this thing open into public debate. And the second thing is that with the prediction of AIDS, this is going to cause problems of the first magnitude which nobody, no policymakers at all, no newspapers at all, have even begun to think about, let alone address. So thank you very much. The black population explosion, the African population explosion, has been to date muted, cut back a little bit by AIDS. But, I mean, it would have been so much greater if it wasn't for AIDS than it already is. But despite AIDS, it has been exploding, no question about it. These latest figures on HIV infection rates, 20% of the population and so on, are so recent that nobody has matched that up to the birth rates and made any kind of demographic predictions about whether African population will actually decline. Certainly the economies will collapse. It may leave millions of children between the ages of 6 and 15 who are not yet sexually active, who will then grow to sexual maturity. Bottom line is, so far, AIDS and HIV infection rate has not impacted the population explosion of Africa, but the prediction will be that sooner or later it will do. Let me respond to that. It's a very, very good question, and that is, I too began to study AIDS in the mid-1980s. In the middle 1980s, there was no question that these projections that are now coming to pass were made. But what you might be forgetting is that at the same time, all the scientists who were publishing the original AIDS figures were saying this is going to take 10 or 15 years. And they also warned that because it would take 10 or 15 years, AIDS as an issue would be widely covered in the first 2 or 3 years because it was so new. And then it was going to die down a lot in public attention because it was not all the big doom and gloom consequences had not come to pass. But that they would do, it said, by the turn of the century. And so I think if you read what they were, the cautions they were saying that we shouldn't lose interest in AIDS, and the 10 or 15 year projections, I think that is what is coming. As far as the changing definition of what is AIDS, or what constitutes AIDS, that is true. The classification of that disease alters. The more knowledge we get, sometimes we expand it, sometimes we contract it. And when we expand the criterion, we obviously begin to include more people than we had before. And some people like to say, well, you see, this is all manufactured. But let me remind you, the data I just gave you was not about AIDS. It's something much, much more profound. It was about HIV, which is the virus that causes the disease. Now, I know a lot of people, some people don't believe that it's a virus, but 98% of scientists believe it is. I believe it is. All the evidence shows that it is. And if it is a virus, that virus is detectable by tests. It's in the bloodstreams. They do random surveys of people in the armed forces, people who go into hospitals, random sampling of prostitutes and truck drivers and so on. They put all these figures together and they make their projections. And these HIV rates are absolutely colossal. No, I'm not predicting that at all. In fact, if anything, I'm saying it's not. It's a major threat to black people, and it is to black people, homosexuals, and intravenous drug users. That's correct. Yeah, there's some truth in that. The Africans have gone through an incredible metamorphosis. During the early 1980s or mid-1980s, they first of all denied that they had any AIDS at all because they did not want the perception to be that Africans were promiscuous and that this was a stereotype they did not want the Europeans to pursue. So at first they minimized their AIDS figures. Today, when sometimes the World Health Organization is the only real organization in town, they are inflating or trying to inflate their figures in order to attract dollars. That's why the World Health Organization is extremely careful, or tries to be as careful as it can, to rule out a variety of different kinds of biases. And what I do in my data is, in fact, I have an entire chapter in my book about methodology, and I use this argument that we must aggregate. If you don't trust the data in Uganda or South Africa or Nigeria about crime, about IQ, about AIDS, or about anything, but if you take an average of many, many, many different countries over many, many different years, and they are consistently in the same direction, then at least you can be sure of the direction of the data, even if the absolute raw numbers are not spot on, or in fact way off.